The world is used to diplomatic disputes. It is not used to ultimatums from allies. When Donald Trump talks about Greenland, this is not policy language. It is conquest language. In a normal presidency, disputes are negotiated, positions soften, words are chosen carefully, but this time the words are blunt. Ownership and control of Greenland is an absolute necessity. That sentence changes everything. Because once a leader declares that anything less is unacceptable, diplomacy stops being a process. It becomes a countdown. Denmark and Greenland are not adversaries. They are partners, allies, members of the same Western system that has held for decades, yet suddenly they are presented with a binary choice: surrender or face consequences. If you care about global stability, this is not a side story. This is a warning sign. Stay with me. Because to understand why this moment matters, we need to see how we got here. What makes this moment dangerous is not a single demand. It is the structure of the demand. This is not a negotiation over access, or basing rights, or joint security arrangements. This is a claim of ownership. When a superpower frames a dispute this way, every diplomatic tool downstream collapses, because compromise requires space, and Trump has deliberately removed it. On one side sits Denmark, a NATO ally, a state bound by international law, a government that cannot sell territory even if it wanted to. On the other side sits Greenland, a self-governing society, debating its future, but explicitly rejecting absorption into the United States. And above both stands Washington, insisting the outcome is predetermined. This is the core problem. The issue is no longer Greenland itself. It is whether power replaces process inside the Western alliance. Once that line is crossed, nothing stays local. Because before we can talk about outcomes, we have to understand the forces that pulled Greenland into the center of global power politics. That story begins far from today's headlines. To understand why Greenland suddenly matters so much, you have to look beyond politics. You have to look at physics. For centuries, the Arctic was protected by ice. Ice was distance. Ice was stability. That barrier is disappearing. Climate change is not an abstract future here. It is melting ice sheets into navigable waterways. It is turning frozen geography into strategic real estate. Greenland sits at the intersection of this transformation between North America and Europe, between the Arctic and the Atlantic, and beneath its surface lie rare earth metals, the minerals that power batteries, weapon systems, modern economies. In a world racing toward technological dominance, those resources are leverage. This is where history matters. The US has maintained a military presence in Greenland for decades, quietly, without ownership. That arrangement worked because rules existed. Allies respected sovereignty. What's different now is not Greenland. It is the belief that rules are optional, and once that belief takes hold, the first crisis is never the last. Because pressure once applied always escalates. The first crack appeared not with troops, but with tone. In Trump's first term, the idea of buying Greenland sounded eccentric, almost comic, a headline, then a shrug, but this time it came back sharpened, formal, unapologetic. When Denmark rejected the sale, that should have been the end. In diplomacy, no is an answer. Here it became an insult. Trump's language hardened. We'll do it the easy way, or the hard way. Those words matter because they reframe disagreement as defiance. Soon after came the pressure campaign, high-profile visits, symbolic gestures, even reports of financial incentives aimed at swaying Greenlanders themselves. This was not persuasion, it was escalation without resolution. And then came the most destabilizing signal of all. Trump refused to rule out the use of force. Once that door opens, it never closes quietly. Allies stop asking what you want. They start asking what you might do. And that is the moment when a political obsession becomes a strategic crisis. What sits beneath all of this is a system most people never see. Not a plan, a mechanism. Trump does not start with institutions. He starts with instinct. Then the system scrambles to justify it. Once the fixation on Greenland was declared, policy followed backward. Security arguments were assembled. Resource narratives were elevated. Threats from Russia and China were placed neatly into frame. Each point, on its own, has logic. Together they form something else. A model where might defines legitimacy. In this model, allies are not partners, they are obstacles to be managed or bypassed. This is why the rhetoric matters more than the specifics. Because when a leader says the outcome is non-negotiable, institutions become theater. Meetings still happen, handshakes still occur, but the decision is already made. That is why diplomatic progress here is an illusion. Because diplomacy requires the possibility of refusal. And in this system, refusal is treated as provocation. Once that logic takes hold, the next crisis does not need to be invented. It simply arrives. This is where you enter the story. Because geopolitical shifts never stay abstract, they land in real lives. If you live in Europe, this is about security you assumed was permanent. The guarantee that allies do not threaten allies. If you live in America, this is about identity, whether power is exercised through leadership or coercion. And if you are Greenlander, this is existential. Your future discussed in foreign capitals. Your sovereignty reduced to leverage. This kind of pressure changes societies quietly. Trust erodes. Anxiety replaces certainty. People begin to ask questions they never needed to ask before. Who protects us? Who decides for us? What happens if we say no? This is how systems fracture. Not with explosions, but with doubt. If this analysis matters to you, pause here, share it, because awareness is the first line of defense in moments like this, and because what happens next does not stop at Greenland's shores. Once doubt spreads, it does not respect borders. What happens in Greenland ripples outward, across the Arctic, across Europe, across the global system that has kept major powers from turning on one another. For European governments, this is a strategic shock, because the threat is not external, it is internal. A NATO ally openly questioning the sovereignty of another, that breaks a taboo older than any treaty text. This is why the European Parliament reacted so sharply, why legal language suddenly turned urgent, a blatant challenge to international law, and the implications go further. If power justifies territorial control, then precedent is set, and precedents travel fast. It becomes harder to condemn Russia in Ukraine, harder to argue that borders matter, harder to defend a rules-based order without sounding selective. Globally, rivals are watching closely, not for what America says, but for what it does next. Because when a system's anchor drifts, everything tied to it starts to move. And that leads us to the only question that now matters. What happens next? From here, the future narrows into three possible paths. The first is restraint. Trump escalates rhetorically, but stops short of action. Pressure replaces force. Time stretches the crisis until attention moves elsewhere. This is the least destructive outcome, but it leaves damage behind, trust weakened, allies uncertain. The second path is coercion without invasion, economic pressure, political manipulation, information warfare aimed at shaping Greenland's choices from the outside. This preserves deniability, but it normalizes interference, and once normalized, it spreads. The third path is the one no one wants to say out loud. Direct action, military or quasi-military moves framed as necessity. That path would rupture NATO, trigger legal and moral comparisons no American leader wants, and permanently alter how the world understands U.S. power. These are not predictions, they are structural outcomes. Because when a leader removes compromise from the equation, systems do not find creative solutions. They collide, and collisions in geopolitics always produce consequences far beyond their origin. This story is not really about Greenland. It is about a choice. Whether the world's most powerful country still believes that rules restrain power, or that power rewrites rules. For decades, the Western system worked because restraint was voluntary, because leaders understood that not everything that is possible should be attempted. Trump's demand breaks that understanding, not quietly, not accidentally. It says outcomes matter more than process, that allies exist on a gradient of usefulness, and once that logic is accepted, it does not stop with one island. History shows us this clearly. Systems don't collapse from a single act. They erode when exceptions become habits. You don't have to agree with Denmark, or Greenland, or even Europe, but you should care when surrender becomes the only acceptable diplomatic outcome. Because when diplomacy dies, force fills the vacuum. If you want to understand where global power is heading next, stay here. Share this analysis and watch closely. The next crisis will not announce itself as unprecedented. It will arrive disguised as necessity.